So we have the next speaker right here, and he will change topic from pine to chestnut. So yeah, Francisco, please go ahead.
Well, hello everyone. I can speak in English or in Castellano. What do you prefer? What does the audience prefer? The slides will be in English? Okay, well, I'll speak in English then. Okay, so yeah, as the moderator told you, I'm going to be speaking about chestnut forests, particularly traditional ecological knowledge and traditional fire knowledge in chestnut forest management, which I think, and I will be arguing towards the end, may raise some important questions and issues and lessons also for the possible practice of prescribed burning in the future. Okay, so let's jump right in. The talk I'm going to be giving is about, well, is already present in two published papers, one in Land Use Policy in 2015 and the other one recently in Human Ecology in 2016. So if you want to read it more carefully and in more detail, those publications are easily available online through ResearchGate and other resources. So I picked chestnut, or we picked in this project chestnut trees a little bit not as a result of a particular interest in the species, but because chestnut trees and chestnut forest ecosystems are an anthropogenic biome, or have been used by human systems, by human societies for as long as we can remember. In this particular area where I studied, recently chestnuts have been identified as a native species. It was believed for a long time that the Romans had introduced the species to the area, but in fact palynological studies by CSIC, by José Antonio López Sáez, have determined that chestnut trees have been present in the area since at least 500 BC. So that's also, I think, an important factor to take into account. So what we were interested in chestnut trees and chestnut forest ecosystems for was in order to test what I call the pre-industrial anthropogenic fire regime conceptual framework, which is a thesis or a hypothesis or a theory that I developed around 2008 during a workshop at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. It attempts to be an interdisciplinary concept, mixing elements from both ecology and the social sciences. So chestnuts were perfect for that purpose because, again, as I mentioned, they are a coupled human and natural system. For as long as we can tell, chestnuts have been actively managed by human societies. So we basically sought research sites where the natural system variables could be maintained constant, that is, forest ecosystems dominated by chestnut trees, or with a significant presence of chestnut trees, but managed differently. In other words, we were looking for places where there were still remnants of traditional management, possibly pre-industrial era management of chestnut forests, and we looked for other sites in the area where that management had been abandoned, okay? And so to speak, natural ecological succession had taken the place of management in managing those forests. And we managed to find some interesting two sites, as I will tell you in a minute. So we've produced two papers so far, one on traditional ecological knowledge that we obtained from interviewing the traditional managers of these chestnut forest ecosystems. And we produced another paper looking at the impact on landscape structure and process of that active intervention by pre-industrial era based societies versus those that had been abandoned, and the impacts on the fire ecology and the fire regimes. That's the original idea that we started doing. Now we're looking also into carbon sequestration issues. So that's going to be the third paper, and I hope that will complete the trilogy. So other findings came along. The original idea was to test the pre-industrial anthropogenic fire regimes, but we, as an accidental result, for those of you who have practiced field research, you know that accidents often happen and are often the most interesting part of the research. We obtained some, what I think are very interesting insights into the fire ecology of chestnut forest ecosystems. thanks to the interviews that we had with older people living in the area. We also, I think, fell into or discovered some interesting fire regime changes that are taking place as a consequence of the disappearance of these practices and the parallel process of rural abandonment. And also, for probably more interesting for the crowd here, possible practical lessons for ecological restoration, for perhaps prescribed burning taking over, so to speak, the role that is being slowly but surely gradually disappearing by these more traditional managers. So the first paper is this one, as I mentioned. It's called Forgetting Fire, Traditional Fire Knowledge in Two Chestnut Forest Ecosystems of the Iberian Peninsula. The goal in this paper was to identify traditional ecological knowledge-based fire practices in these chestnut forest ecosystems, try to characterize theoretically what this concept that I mentioned earlier, the pre-industrial anthropogenic fire regime. The historical baseline would be these practices, which have been carried out at least, as I mentioned, for 2,500 years approximately, and determine the forest policy implications of the gradual disappearance of these practices. And the other paper that was published recently is called Divergent Fire Regimes in Two Contrasting Mediterranean Chestnut Forest Landscapes. And the goal of this paper was to identify the impacts of landscape structure and function of TEK-based traditional burning practices, generate testable hypotheses for chestnut forest ecosystems, because we believe that chestnut forest ecosystems throughout Europe and their natural range, Castanea sativa, are experiencing similar processes. And generating hypotheses also about the human system drivers of these fire regime changes. So the sites were located in the central area of Spain, Sistema Central, in the so-called Sierra Oeste of Madrid. We chose two sites, Casillas and Rozas de Puerto Real, which are only 7 kilometers apart. And the Rozas de Puerto Real site, we could say, has been abandoned. It's a chestnut forest ecosystem that has been abandoned. There's not too much burning taking place there. And in Casillas, which is further uphill, there's still a lot of traditional burning taking place by the local community over there, which is still has an economy that is largely dependent on chestnut production. Just so that you can see some basic indicators of the contrasts that we were looking for. As you can see, the place where traditional ecological knowledge is still present is much poorer, is a much poorer site than the more developed sites. So there's perhaps more incentive to maintain those traditional modes because of the dependence on chestnut production for the local economy. And as you can see, for example, family income differences are quite high, as well as I think is worth noting, the money spent on fire exclusion by the different forestry departments of the Comunidad de Madrid and the Comunidad de Castilla y León. The Comunidad de Castilla y León spends about 14 euros per hectare in fire exclusion and fire suppression. The Community of Madrid, which is of course far wealthier, spends about 75 euros. Okay, and as we shall see, that has had some paradoxical consequences for the fire regime, perhaps not the intended one. We then, in this first paper, try to look at traditional ecologic knowledge and characterizing this pre-industrial anthropogenic fire regime. This is what the landscape looks when the folks there are burning. Actually, this was a day of low activity. When you go into this valley, you can see a lot of these smoke plumes strewn all over the landscape. The locals generally joke about them being considered sort of pyromaniacs by the forest agents, etc., because in certain parts of at certain times of the year, all of them burn practically and simultaneously. This is what it looks up close. Folks there are divided between what technique is the best to use. Right now, most are burning with pile burning techniques, and it has its logic, as we will see in a minute. But some older folks actually argued that amanta, what they call amanta burning, blanket burning, so broadcast burning, was the real way to do this. But in any case, that's what they do now, mostly pile burning. The process, we all know what it looks like. You pile the leaves, and you set fire to the different piles of the chestnut leaves. One of the surprising insights was that I felt ashamed because the person that you're seeing in this photograph is about 80 years old. I tried to help him raking the leaves, and I was raking them away from the tree. And one of the basic insights that emerged from this encounter with this person was that he was saying, no, you got to pile the leaves towards the tree, not away from the tree. And it was apparent that this person was using smoke in a very directed way to sort of fumigate the tree, so to speak. Okay, and that is one of the big lessons from the fire ecology of chestnut forest, as we will see in a minute. So anyway, this was the results of the interview amongst peasants, local communities in both sites. In both sites, people used and understood that there were a lot of reasons for using fire. So I'm going to accelerate a little bit over here. These are the traditional ecological knowledge, different forms that we discovered, and the most important one being as a control for Phytophthora cinnamomi, fungus infection in chestnut trees. They claim that, through the use of smoke and by burning the leaves, they can control that plague and trees are healthier. When comparing fire regime impacts in both sites, we see that in the more traditional site, most burning takes place in the traditional non-vegetative season. So the fire regime is in the fall, in the autumn, whereas in the more developed side with more abandonment, more fires take place in the summer. So that's another surprising, well, or not so surprising if you've read the work of Minnick finding, which is basically that in the less developed site, there are many more fires, but very fewer larger fires. And in the more developed site, there are fewer fires, but they take place during the summer and they're much larger. And of course, they've had a large fire of 1,200 hectares, whereas in the less developed site, there haven't been any large fires at all in the period we studied. Regarding the scientific validation of smoke as a fungicide, we took a look at previous research, and someone had bothered actually looking at the chemical composition of leaves and discovered that sulfur was present. And for everyone who knows a little bit about pesticides, if sulfur is present in the leaves, there may be something to that, but we didn't have money to explore this thesis further. Okay, I think I'm a little bit out of time, so I'm just going to show you some basic effects. This is what a traditional managed landscape looks like the photograph up there, and the photograph down there would be what chestnut forests look when they're abandoned. And as well, if you understand the fuel situation, of course, the picture on the bottom describes a landscape that is much more prone to fires. So we looked at different landscape structure effects. We used dendrochronological methods. I'm going to fly through these because I'm out of time. So in our dendrochronological analysis, you can see what we discovered, which is basically much more fires with greater severity if we measure it in terms of scars in the more developed site than in the less developed site. Which seems to be corroborated by other Iberian Peninsula findings. And finally, also the consequences of abandoning traditional ecological knowledge burning, base burning, is that chestnut forests on the far left are losing their presence with regards to pine species encroachment and other broadleaf species. So anyway, I'll end up with that. I had a little bit more here also on the demographic decline, but the takeaway home lesson is that non-vegetative seasonal burning in chestnut forests of the litter fall seems to prevent larger fires. And therefore, if prescribed burning is going to take the place of the local population, which is aging and disappearing, and that has this traditional ecological knowledge, then perhaps there are some lessons to be learned from these practices that I described before. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francisco. I'm sorry we don't have time for questions, but you can talk to him anytime.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, first, I would like to thank one more to all speakers for very interesting talks and keeping on time. Thanks to you for coping with 10 talks in a row.